What is? What is this? Ah, yeah. 346. Message. Ah, yeah.
Gen Rinpoche, Ninkung Dele, and a very good morning to Katrina Brooks as well, and to everybody online. Thank you for joining us. And we'll begin with some prayers that you'll find in the chat box.
To the teacher and Tao, transcendent destroyer, oneness gone, full destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one unto bliss, Lord, the world's supreme guide of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha and Tao, transcendent destroyer, glorious Father, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who rise and I bow, with pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme sun, stays like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not incomparable, wise one, to you I bow. Great, compassionate, protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, and true virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings, the holy field endowed with good perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the four faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Iram Guru Ramna Mandalakam Nirtayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Oh, yeah. This one,
Jason Genla.
oh, yeah. Oh, to the current. Mode. There, Chizonga Pachimbi. The head and the shin all the last. Then the never tarry some shins. Near Ganjigla, Namgelo, and Chindi some shins in nature. Duba Chawash in the Dodge and Yajango to Nimbule Macus. Najung Ajan Yamlet Darsha, Tandi Kajan Shin Jansalos. Oh, she's some Badara. Marada Tanda top the Melody Sumbara. Tanjorki Melodies. Ishingi Novo. Then le Lavares or Ted and the Shin of the last. Ishin Novo de Casora. And then drew us some that she was some ship. Some out of search any. Togalia. Genja Jamolation, Chubachana. Said these Circle Lodula Sobakanga. Pomba Meba Yungu Sigora. Or Tendre Shinobu. Guy don't Timpum Sinaya. Said Dico Togo Tamsola Sobacarinati. You want to with Mato. Till a love what you Tanjo, Milu, did and the troop to Gege. Joa troop to bet on that Tama. Joa Chima Mesola Metonga. Tada mi Kovan Samsia. Del Tene top to Mare Sungara. This on that Tavette Shinobu. Gadon Timbu Legend Hava de Esor. Tavette Shinola last. Or the Tishona. Yeah.
So here, as the Master Jelama Tsongkhapa has said, this life of leisure is even more precious than a wish-granting jewel. That I have found such an existence is only just this once. So hard to find, yet like a flash of lightning, it is easy to vanish. So here, contemplating this situation, it's vital to realize that all mundane pursuits are like the empty grain husks floating in the wind, and that we must extract the essence of this human existence. So the life of leisures and endowments that we have right now. This is something that is extremely precious, even more precious than a wish-granting
here,
jewel.
contemplating this
This kind of
situation, it's
wish-granting
vital
jewel
to
and you
realize
clean
that
it and
all
you put it in
mundane
a special
pursuits
sort
are
of
like the
place up on
empty
the
grain
roof or
husks
whatever,
floating
it's
in the
able
wind,
to
and that we must
dispel all poverty. It can fulfill all of the kinds of needs of this life in terms of granting us food or wealth and clothing and so forth. But here, the kind of life that we have right now is even more precious than hundreds of those, thousands of those, because a wish-granting jewel doesn't have the ability to even at the very in the future. And so despite the kind of ability of such a gem or thousands of them to dispel whatever poverty we might have in this life, our life that we have, this precious human rebirth with its leisures and endowments, is far more precious than that.
뭐야? 다가던데 신호를 나스. 등하라지 댄조그 밀리드 소스 메시지 쓰거라. 배주하고 제가 내고 이신 노블에 하고나시 돈도 툭툭 그래서. 대나 가라주 삼리날이야. 단도 밀리드 밀리 코란데 메시 코란께 집부던 달바. 당시아마도 대표적인 여름부 마음 받을 때 탐해버리시러 마음에 대화다 통해 돈다데 탐해버리시대 현대 고치부터 밀리란서도 가리네고 강에 여도 여기를 때 대삼지티 그 내가 지금 말도 교황하시다 전에 탐해버 삼을 당게 되나 나서도 야지나 토마메바 마지나 배 여름 시부지 여가 소자 뒤던다 가고 삼을 당게 와라 현대 지부터 담아니 봐 마음바 용주 전다가 삼을다도 되게 셔르시거라 어디 인도 가서 메시지 저 치마 페이지에 또다 원도 함이 고바 아니 타바 코알 땐도 코르마고 베 타바 대라치고 많이 봤으면 탐제가 통통되게 산제지 고바 주베가 탑시 단다 고촌이야 전에 제에 버치를 해서거라 근데 가야 마셔서 현대 지부 사회 통해 거야 지부 전달이야 계셔봐이나 아니 빼 방부를 송거라 저거들 신 놀래라 되더니 뭐 다른 잠시 니가 지글라 남게로다서 근데 매일 사시부터 왜 다른 렌즈자 토를 맞을 따버리시 망부로 시비지 톱쳐져 여버 텐데 말을 송어라 되더니 뭐 다른 잠시 인세 저 다른 밀류 야부터 받을 배주 야부 지신 것이 거래 송거라 야 어디죠
So, when we talk about this life of leisures and endowments, the kind of human life that we have right now, if we use it well, we can accomplish something quite meaningful. But often we only think of this life. We're not really contemplating the future, our future suffering and happiness that is really endless. We are going to take rebirth again and again. And so here, if we are to only think about what it is that we need in this life, using this life in order to get what we need in terms of food or clothing or shelter and so forth, that's quite a limited kind of a vision. And so here, beyond using this sort of human life of leisures and endowments, at the very least, we can make sure if we use it in a meaningful way that we get another rebirth as a human or a god. And even going beyond that, we can pursue liberation from all of samsara, which is in the nature of suffering. And thinking beyond even that, we can attain the state of Buddhahood in which we are able to benefit all sentient beings. And so here, if we are to let ourselves just waste this life, using it to get what we need in terms of food and clothing and the affairs of just this life, that's quite a loss. That's something that's quite sad. And here, as it continues, this is something that we have found just this once. It's not as though we are in a situation where we are going to guaranteed to get a life like this time after time after time, but rather we need to, recognizing the preciousness of this and how it is something extremely rare, put ourselves to making it actually meaningful and thinking about that endless future that lays ahead of us.
뭐야 대회된데 신호 된다니 못하래 니가 지글라서라 또 니가 시버스 토요할 때 집에 땡케버를 시버스 이름 못해 얘네 자그래 마음 반드 시체서 그래 근데 말을 쓰거라 신도네 니가 멜로디 쓰거라 더대 신 된다니 못하래 니가 지글라서 니가 시버스래 아테코 이름 못해 땡케버를 시버스 대 얘네 자그래 근데 말을 써 지글래라 보래서 니가 지글라 남게로던다스 남갈 거 루블루블도 콜로리 때문에 루블도 지금 남산 jig to Mato, she take you to Mukoyaki or Mara. Nika Jilla Namgel out and Ras. Did send it on that day. But on the Jom Shimabu, Joshima Yurin Bull Samatana, to the Suzu is ready or no, Nega Yutunduji to that. As a measure of Shinia Kashi Kasha long of Chuchi Kasha Katerina Lo Kuchuche, Tindete Shimato, Shidategi Omarto. Oh, Tindukasa. Nika Jilla Namgelo that Ras, should be something she then shall. Sindi message tanda chunju re do asegora tende samlutana chundi sabje jiden chawa bimba chawa shintojna jiden ji chawa sindi chibu tanda te ko pakpa tende drui pakpa tamasuna drai pakpa tende tende ya tende kasure charana shire segora lungli ya chana dura chi pa tung anite ya chana lakpa le chana ane lungja pakpa de pa ki dru de la de gra ningbu le ya re chiwara Jiden Chow Cindy Chibuton that the Sendilus order, Madame Mambal Panto, a Kege or Marisura. Jiden Chow Bimba Sauce, Papa, Sagway Children, Kiss and like Leke or Mara, Sendil sauce on this or Bimba Chow in the Tokine. Ninsen Kuntu Nimbulemba Kuyose. Cindy Chibuton the membership. Shima Penzella Peg, Nimbuton Dachi, Lentoban about to check with this water. Bimba Chow in the Nimbulemba.
Of lightning, it is easy to vanish. So this life that we have right now, so precious as it is extremely difficult to find, but it also doesn't last long. If it were the case that this were something that lasted for a very long time, perhaps it would be different. But this life is like a flash of lightning, wherein it flashes for a moment and by its nature disintegrates right away. And so here, when we really think about future lives and the kind of endless future that faces us, this life right now is like a flash of lightning. Although some may live for 50, 60, 80, 90 years, it is still something that is quite short in comparison to the future that we face. And so just to sustain ourselves for this life, doing activities that are only for this life is sort of, as it said, it would be like trying to take the kind of husk of the grain rather than taking the thing that has the essence or the nutrients. As it says, contemplating this situation, it's vital to realize that all mundane pursuits, the activities that we would do for just this life alone, are like the empty grain husks floating in the wind. Like when you beat grain in order to get the actual grain itself, those husks, the skin, just blow off in the wind. There's nothing that really has any essence to it. And so too, to do activities that sustain ourselves but are really just for this life, thinking about getting food and clothing and our reputation, if we expend ourselves in just that, it's quite a waste. It's such a loss. And so therefore, we must extract the essence of this human existence, use it for something more meaningful, thinking about that long future ahead of us, not just engaging in mundane pursuits. And then he says, I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire for liberation too should do likewise. So Je Lama Tsongkhapa, a great yogi, practiced in this way, and we too should follow his example, taking the essence of this life and not getting caught up in just mundane pursuits.
Oh yeah, 어디인데 가서래 가시 다쳤디 다 예치다 가라도 미 관계 시거래 단단단데 고 대화다 강에 들을 삼을다 아마도 이름부 삼을다 해야 되고 공부를 때와라 단단단데 미 삼을 통도 저거 들으시되나 되게 삼을 마음 발로주 니슈 섬중압주 배 경고 차선의 용해대 대주 강가 삼을다 통게 가고로 와 단단단데 가르치는 샤삼사 이름부 삼을다 해야 되고 가고를 지워라 어디에도 가라서 세디 땅자 다른 무슨도 통해야 돼. 가요 말이지. 다른 무슨도 용돼야 들어봐. 뒤도 간거 다른 무슨도 용돼서자 다들 강에 전부 개치 무심을 좀 맞지라지 통교하라. 어디 이나고 가시 세대마도 다들 개치 그래. 마음바 연하면 간시서 그래. 마음바 연하면 간시서. 맨에다 되려라. 아니 저를 그렇게 감비박사 나시래. Sendela kara kibji chi kikpata kiawata chi kechi mashasa tumde kaan kibji kaan tende che urusera kiawa chima sadi yo marisa 개발적으로 다 쓴 거고 다 소시아를 써서 어떤 데서도 차이는 거라 어떤 데 가서 그래 매나 그 첸들이야 지구 돈다 마치스도 미개와 샬라 처아파 페바투 상부치스 거라 추치스도 자 샬라 페바투에다 처아 마치스 전부다 저를 시소네 소소 메시데 기부시게 낭미 메시데 기부시게 저 현다 라다 로여가 메시데 기부시게 저 뒤던 다시 라고라 텔레초시거라 뒤치시거라 뒤쳐라고 저 치마 여매일이야 다 저렇게 매나야 그 톨라도야게 요마로 저기에는 저 치마 매나 겨울아게 메도와 첸델 무슨도 중에든 대부 간거 정도도 라지 시야기 소소셈레 시대 용거리 밀레 시대 용거리 잠바다 저에서는 메시지 기부 야부시게 요라 다 공동아 제시 저 치마 요나면 메시까 좀 주잖아니 자불리디 가서라 내가 전부실래 내가 요라 뒤에 가서라 저 치마 예매 타 맞으면 이나야 저 치마 여배 시자저 치마 여배 있는 년가라 지단에 그 뭐고 간갈 치료 그 뒤이나 매도이나 지시나 저나 그런 교육지 누구도 소에서 제 티티우를 시샤티 또 야치 계셔티 제도 다음에 생각해서 뒤전도 가가 그렇지 교회를 치진다면 되기도 와 알아서 소고이나 그 셈다 가가 전에 마음바나 또 대대 가셔서다 또다 가셔 또래 되면 진짜 용기도 발랑게 거든데 로마 붙이는 배 또도 장무슨 배 때도 잡도 가든데 때도 반접도 더 디나 시작 건다면 요에도 왔지 되는 줄지 소고 되는 줄지 가는 시작도 디냠도 셈지 알아 소 셈생게 뒤도 좋아 마이게 뒤도 좋아를 때는 내가 챙겨지도 소고를 때는 내가 챙겨지 와라 티 셈데 준디야 코나 저도 되요 알아 자 티코 준디 셈데 류다 가가 주도자 류기 미 소아데 류디게 셈기 땡치 마도데 미 소아데 강가 나와 강가 예도 거라 셈데 참무 치제야 셴다고 더제서라 칠야 류드 비차네야 지도 용용 거라 어디인데 가서라 겨치마 예메 타 마주네 고쳐셔버데 제보군에도 다른 무슨도 요한테 체들려 해도 딜레 개체슈데 마오바나 텐다미데 대화동에도 마오바나 용기어를 뜻이거라 어디 땅에 만들어서 야 뜻이려나
So, some have this thought. I mean, all of us recognize that we are going to die. There's some sort of a recognition of that, but most of the time we get caught up in the present, in what's happening right now, the things that we want or the things that we want to avoid. And so it's difficult for us even to think about like 50, 60 years into the future and having a concern about that future happiness and suffering, right? Because what we see directly are the kind of experiences that we are going through now, the sort of happiness that we experience, the suffering that we experience, and that seems to be so important. And so here, if there is a future life or not, some aren't really sure if there is or not. I mean, and some people concluding that, oh, they're definitely not future lives, sort of like the Lokayatas, or those that are only concerned, the kind of hedonists, one could say, don't think about karma, don't think about virtue and non-virtue, and just say, well, do what makes you happy. Enjoy as much as you can, because there's nothing that is going to come beyond this life. And those that say that there is something beyond this, those kind of scholars are really just tricking you to try to make you do something. But here, if we recognize that the Dharma practice of engaging in not harming others and trying to generate love and compassion and benefit others, that's not about some sort of tricking you, but rather those kinds of practices of Dharma will have an impact right now. You will be happier. Those around you will be happier. And so that's Dharma. Even if you maybe haven't decided completely whether there are past and future lives, whether there's a future life that you're going to go to, it's not as though this is some kind of a deception, but rather you will be happier. You will experience less suffering the more that you are able to cultivate this kind of attitude of not harming others and trying to benefit them, showing love and compassion. You will experience less suffering suffering now, you and others around you will be happier. Whereas if you engage in your afflictions, getting angry, having a lot of desire and jealousy and pride and so forth, there will be suffering that you experience as a result of that right now. And so if there are not future lives, well, you're not losing out somehow, right? You are still making yourselves happier now. But if there are future lives, then you are creating both a good result in the present as well as a good ripening result in the future. And so when we think about the kind of continuity of phenomena, we have our body and that acts as a support for the mind, and at death that separates. But it's not as though the mind becomes non-existent, but in the same way that external things, when we look outside around us at rocks and stones and mountains and flowers and so forth, there is a continuity to even those atoms, right? Atoms may change state and so forth, but they don't become non-existent. We have a flower that comes into bloom, and then it seeds carry on and so forth, but each of the atoms that composes that has a kind of continuity. We can see this in the fact that, like, for example, animals that died long ago, some of their skulls and bones and so forth are preserved. Some go on and become other things, but there is a continuity, and so too there's a continuity to mind. It is the case that there comes a point in which the body can no longer act as the support for the mind and the feelings and so forth, and at that point those separate. Our body will, the atoms, material atoms that comprise that, will go on to be other things, and so too our mind, the very subtle mind, will continue on, and that is going to take another rebirth, right? So here, recognizing that the Dharma practice really of being non-harmful and benefiting others is something that brings good results in the now, regardless of whether there are future lives or not. And it is something that can potentially bring about those kinds of good ripening results in the future as well.
Oh yeah, oh the Indukasura. Whereas Chitako Mesiti Dewa and Alexi Ordo. Levara Karchane, Saya Toya Koya, Tangila Soba Mana, Kangi or Tungi or Timea and Legacy. So Kotungelia, Luigi Tunga, the Semji Tungas in Yoguda. Semji Tunga, the Samutanda, Dima de Shana Luigi Tunga, the Saya Mechaya, Tati, Chilo Penjo, my utility and the Kangi Yoguda. The Semji Tunga, the Tikanga Mabachi, so the Samutan Joke, the Yunguara. So Nambe Church and the Karla Gueras and Samutanda, Jurjuta Laguara. Sem dua sektoa. Tibachi amaja kiopus so rang sem ne so de denisai. Sem le kurju dan sem jongbo de nga je chado dren sem mil tongju che da ro chwa che da de sem nyamba tu ma nyu ru tong se sem sangbo de ma ru tong se de de ta ye nga ra zu nyamba sam be thar chim ba sha ro ane sangbo chama de thar chim ba ya sa je ko ba nga ra zu sem de cha chim bu shi bu chi wa re se Roa sem jiran shi wasa de tumana lobo roa se sem de le kurju tana tana yoba che ko sem de kondu ran shi ma re kondu de kagan roya yo re se o telia kurju tana so so semba ki ba yong ra chi pen jo ge tin yen cha sam tan dan de na na de ya bu je me che de ki bu je ge to ra chi pen jo jang jang sam tan sem de nga je tra do da chi chok shi dan tong jo da de so so semba ki bu me mo sum to do nga che 무슨 제도라 배저 장장이네 고 추구도 기부 시버지 요고르데 추구 기부 요 말에 사회 통해서 받다도 인도 거기 있지르데 섬제도 건조 망하듯이 알았다도 삼을담마시나 삼을담시나 되라 tin데 소데 삼을담다들라고 와라 샘데 배 야우치 요라 야르잖아 들다나 tin데 가지 준준하려고도 감성나 샘레 직바 생각하면서 Shanada Sul Sheguras, the Miss Simla Shegura, Samtanda. Etambam Shegura, Laza Shegur, the Laza Miss Oviora, Etambam Miss Oviora. To the same the Samlutan, Yambachi, your teacher, and it's Soyora. Simply I wasn't doing a lima chubata te yagura. It's really legate yardugara. The same Yamba and any rang, but she's a me again, Basukanga. But the ditching one never comes on a social similar chip by Shanka Messade. Sem samlutanda de yabu kirchita guara. The yara chay in ya. Ishin no de similar chatel, social similar social chatel to the shagdwa. Sem the abuji doing a rant giver. similar to any lunga chuba de Saurdora. Ni shan giba. Oti in this Simja Tamjela Saji Riyuse. John Tamja Tadra, the Yunda Tamja Dabachi, Riyo, they say. Or Tindachi, Razati Yom Missibra to the Marwa. Tinda imba the Sosu Yamuto Nahaku, they say what. So where is the Comja Tos, Chitonachida, Tos and Yamata Meda Conduchum and Doate Comisum together. Oh, Taishida Comna Yara dress is a day something. Sosu Yamuto Nahako together. Yeah, that is Lana Mandas.
So here in general, we strive for our happiness, right? If we are lacking the kind of material conditions, if we lack food and conducive conditions for our survival, that is going to create suffering. But here, when we think about the kind of suffering and happiness that we have the suffering of both body and mind. And while lacking those kinds of good conditions can lead to physical suffering, our mental suffering is largely the kind that we create with our own mind, right? And so the kind of suffering that we generate through our mind is something that we can transform by sort of transforming this unruly, this sort of demon of our mind by working too, as it says, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So to subdue the mind is really about increasing our positive, our good thoughts and getting rid of those kinds of negative thoughts that increase our suffering, that create our suffering. And so this is something that our mind has a great potential. As it's said, the nature of mind is clear light, and the kind of afflictions are adventitious. They aren't part of the nature of mind. It's not as though anger is in the nature of our mind. And so if we have this kind of understanding, then say we have the kind of external wealth that we need to not be impoverished, to not experience intense physical suffering, and the right way of thinking, well, then we will really be happy. But it's not as though happiness can come from just having wealth. If that were the case, then all rich people would be quite happy. And we can see that that's not the case. Actually, for some, having an increase in their wealth increases the kind of mental suffering and concerns that they experience. And so when we think about the source of actual happiness, it is the one that comes through the transformation of our mind. As Shantideva has said in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, there's nothing scarier than the mind. If we are to fear something, it should be to fear the mind. Although we might think like, oh, the kind of weapons that humans create, the kind of things like an atom bomb, we should be afraid of that. Well, where did that come from? That came from the mind of beings. And so if our mind is negative, it has incredible potential to create suffering and harm. And so we need to use our mind in the proper sort of way. We need to take control of it and come to transform it. Because on the other hand, this mind is like a wish-fulfilling jewel. We have the capacity to transform our mind for the better, to actually develop good qualities all the way up until Buddhahood, in their culmination in Buddhahood. And so, as it is said, we all have this kind of Buddha nature. We all have the potential to become a fully enlightened Buddha. It's a matter of developing and increasing those good qualities until we bring them to the state of their culmination. And so every single sentient being has that kind of capacity. And this is something that we can really establish for ourselves based upon our understanding of our own mind and the power of habituation. Like, for example, if we begin to practice patience, we can see that it increases more and more. Our mind has that kind of capacity to develop qualities more and more. And if we actually understand that, then we can see our mind as being a wish-fulfilling jewel. It can become that for us rather than something that we need to fear the most.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's it. Oh, the in the number that Tawana Shichenera. So Tawada Tunga said, so get less and egg. Go some get some get some lutanda, Lunga get Jobacheta, this and Eleteneco, in Debus and get the Yungudesigora. They are called Lechum Desegate, Cachete, Jonga Masasha, but the Tendera. Chitan Le, Sambuchena, Sambu Yonata, Lang and Bachena, Debu Namba Yonata, said Deleco, Musum to Toya Yesera, Musum to Toto Gudesigora. Maradu send dileta, Yawachet, Cabo de Mato. 카셰 첸딜레 코 레가 야부체 당분에 야부 롭종 체 야부체데 코 야부시라래 요라 카셰 당분에 코 녜발 콤데 테 드레부 투가 요야 요라 티 렉텔레 카셰 통주 연주세 셋데레 사네 레 상부체네 상부레야 요바 레 녜바체네 녜바레야 요바 띵아 정고 소토데 요라 레 레스도 레지 쳬바체다 카네케제 셰다 sem기 사물타다 카가 테 레다 드레데 요라 티드코 le sangel tene tebu tidu yoya te chendel ngusum du tu ye chera ta mangbo che kyawa ngama nam samba ta trash tawa de kale kabure she dire te ina chidan le sambu chene debu sambu ta tinde ngobo kangali kyu ye se gara kyu te shanda che wang do che me se so so maomba tidu ki kyu te so so le ra le gre se gara ngai tidu te mi shanda che la kwa le na ni nya ga chim shidara che ke yo marwa 소소 마음 봐야 돼. 저기 소소라고 말이야 돼서라. 가가리 교요래. 교연데 겨와 처망에 손을 매게 사다 밀게 돼 가르쳐래. 교요래. 매게 왔죠디 봐. 융아 예수기 권에 매게 왔죠디 봐. 겨와 줘도 좀나. 티 교대 내 손을 맞게 사다 밀게 교대. 다 겨와만에 사셔네 теле한테 봐지제 샤톰 전에 다 안돼요라. 티 교대가 좀 두고요래. 디나시 하다 미 겨와라야 동해 요래서 기분 되게 삼로 거서나 말 고알에 타라치고서 레다 녀문배 샤와도 주네 풍분 돌레 제고 같아 소소 라마 매버체 겨왕아만 없어 사베 레게들 때네 풍분 돌레 제고 친제들 할게네 밀게네 내갑상에 지레 마도 거 풀라고 강가강에 지레 되어라 딜레 타라치 딜레 주요래서라 네 가르스도자 난진세데 담보 ngao nyambe rao ya ngan zimbate. Tel tene ni ngao se chakbe yu shuk chabu shibu shasara. Ene ngaye sara liu pe chasada soso kwaya charabu chile shenja kesa shuk chabu shasara. Ne teta tima tu se pe charas pocho de kaptu chasa kondu sasada nyamba che kusa shirup chi shasara. Tel tene ti samlu shangwa tu chune ne chatangu le dhami dasane kwa kugyora. koa korete ko gyuyo res, gyu di res, di pa ka na, di ka tuku res go ra. Da me ba da, tongpa ni da se, chamba da ni se se do. Semje tamje ge tuyan tu tu ga sanje sanje tu pa na shi, gyuyan ku se yun de kun de gyur gyuyo res. Tin gyuye di ka res, gyu ka res. Tanda pa da nga razu so so ke chi shu se ne. Gyo thoma me ba ne. Ti wang ge che ne, ni sa ta da kanga yuwa ti yo go res. 다 삼로 거라 제법 잡고 다 셴cewa 시도 소소 개시슈지네 야가 용야네 다주 겨 통을 매번에 지대래 다 다주도 야부 쉬차 공개를 지어라 대차요 말마 도르도르 시도요래 어쨌는데 셴 개시와 되고 있잖아 셴 조지 그래서 소소 충주지 우리 개 충주지 그자 다 셴cewa 야 나라도 삼루탄데 소소 대환들에 동해 멘도래 디나시 미사마 심제 성마tin데 레아 섬 소알레 거라 소소 강엔 세데 바나시 챤다도 강엔 세야 자데서 어tin데 삼루탄데 소소 레가 강가리 챤데 던달 챤도 요래 챤레 펜바트에도 소소 펜바트에나 챤데도 소소 랭게데도 거라 저 다게 챤시 바스 강가 레가 처음 탐제 Chimba chudu soba sabdela soba kanga shangi to konan ba shagora. O tichene ani shandu tarshi batu ve sage chumde de de ko ma thoya yore se kibu chimbe samlute ko ta se tumde she marwa samlu chuchu ta ne de de regione de judi sana debu de yongre se che. O tende jang o tu che ne kibu chung de de chimbe sama lam de shagora. O tinde te sambu samlu ta ne ro. 심지어 탐지가 또 통계 깨고서 연대 군대지 가사실에 교화 자기섬 예령부 섬을 따오라 세질 뇌질에 상계했을 텐데 세도 요르데 다들 알아줬다 올라가고래 가셔 요요 시그라 15배 뒤에나 뒤에배 예령주 섬을 따 가시래 뒤에 배잖아 요것도 밀강선에서 어떤 데 뒤에 뒤에 중에 마음방에 봐서 토위에 섬사르지 Samlu Rinpoche Thabkhe. Dile tanda lobge yinse, tanda dil lobto, tatene dil lobge, Tesolanga looking in some look judges. Tande Nashinja Tavares to take in some Yumidua. A Tandanga Dimata took Matanga Judge and the Tikanga looking some Samlican. Miss some said they pay never Madayora. Look, Combesus Sarah. Kaza Yara de la Kaza Yar and Red the Caress and Combachiated. Kumji Jason Yar and Red Toucher, some given the Kanga. Rangating the Cocombalitan and the Yara Dura. Chambada saw Tavares take on the Yara Toucher Sarah. What in the Samutaje. Right, give Kasura. Chungudan drink the Shimbu Sama Lambda to Rimbichane. Sanji Kovan told me what Mao Bang about the chicken, some so about Tasha. The Trumgis of the jeans. You have maybe sort of sometime you don't about to see you have sometime. They don't have any training, some Tobada Samba Combatum Gijubacha Oyambe. Kunu said them the Sena, the Penachimbo. Oh, didn't say them the Samba shoes, yeah, this. Mamula Stara Hakudu.
Mhm. So here again, the mind is then something that is very powerful, and it is based upon our kind of mind that we then engage in acts of body and speech. So according to the view of Buddhism, everything is causal, right? Good and bad, our happiness and suffering result from causes, from karma. We create karmas that in turn lead to certain results, and some of those results we can see within a single lifetime. I mean, there are karmas that we have created in the past that ripen in this life, and there are actions that we take in this life that will not ripen until future lives. But we can establish that there is this kind of causality by looking at this life alone. When we do things that are good, that leads to good results. When we engage in a way that is negative, that leads to negative results. And so karma, again, is something that our mind is the driver of then our physical and verbal actions, which in turn we can see the results of some of those. Now, there are some that we can't know the full sort of details, the subtleties of all of that karma, but we can recognize that our suffering and happiness is in our own hands. It would be quite frightening if it were the case that that were in somebody else's hands, right? That they were the ones that were going to give us happiness and suffering, but rather it is the case that we have that capacity to create our own happiness and suffering through the actions that we undertake. So if we take up the kind of practice of abandoning the 10 non-virtues and accomplishing the 10 virtues, then we are able to ensure that we can gain a good rebirth, that we aren't going to fall into the lower realms. And even going beyond that, then we can think about the fact that even if we were to attain a human or a divine kind of a body, we're still within this kind of cycle of suffering, wherein within samsara we have to cast off and take up these contaminated aggregates due to the force of our karma and afflictions. And this too is something that is causal in the same way that the kind of rebirth that we take is based upon our karmas. Our process of taking up and casting off aggregates itself has a cause. It is caused by this kind of initial ignorance, this grasping at an I. And then from that sense of I comes a sense of mine. We hold to like my body, my things, these that are on my side. And we have the clinging to the things that are sort of attractive to us or that we see as being on our side. And then we see the other as being like an enemy. And under the control of that fundamental ignorance, this grasping at a self, we then engage in these various karmas that in turn perpetuate rebirth within samsara. But if we realize selflessness, if we realize emptiness, we are able to eliminate that cause and thereby attain liberation from that cycle of suffering. And so too, going even beyond that, we have the capacity to become a fully enlightened Buddha, like Buddha Shakyamuni, one who has attained all good qualities and eliminated all faults, who is fully able to benefit all sentient beings. And we see that really, if it were, the kind of thing that prevents us from getting there is this self-centered attitude, this self-cherishing attitude. If it were the case that this were something that were really beneficial to us because we've been engaging in it since beginningless time, we should be in a really great position. If it were working for us, that would be great, but it's not actually working. It is detrimental to us. And so by recognizing that this self-cherishing attitude is something that isn't producing some kind of good result, but rather that cherishing others is what can allow us to become a fully enlightened Buddha. It actually, by recognizing first that all other sentient beings are just like me, just the same in wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer, all of the kind of capacity to become a being who has those good qualities, who has eliminated all faults. We have the capacity to become that by engaging in the practices of generosity and ethics, patience, joyous effort, and so forth. And we have the capacity to become a being who can perfect the aims of others. We shouldn't see this as sort of like a nice story, like, oh yeah, that's great, you know, Buddha Shakyamuni did this in the past, but this is actually based upon reality. We are able to, through our effort, if we make effort in a long-term kind of a way, we need to think long-term. It's not, I mean, it's possible that maybe some beings here will attain Buddhahood within this lifetime, but for the most of us, it's a long-term kind of thinking. And we have all of the capacity to be able to do this if we make an effort at it. And this is based upon the sort of capacity of mind. Our mind, again, is something that through habituation can develop good qualities. We can develop both good and bad, but we can also eliminate all of those kinds of faults as they are not intrinsic to the nature of mind. So mind is really incredible in this way. It's not as though we have to think about, again, attaining Buddhahood right here and now, but over the process of the long term, by expanding our kind of vision, we can see that we can increase those kinds of good qualities more and more, our love, our compassion. And this is something that is definite. We don't have to just sort of think that that's, again, a nice sort of story, but this is something that we can establish for ourselves. And we are able to do this by training our minds in first the kind of paths of the being of small scope, the being of middling scope, and finally getting to that of the being of great scope. And so by recognizing that we have all of the potential, all of the capacity, and it's a matter of making effort over a long period of time, we can really set this as our goal, that may I become a fully enlightened Buddha, one who has attained all good qualities and eliminated all faults, who is able to fully affect the welfare of other sentient beings. And for that purpose, I'm going to train my mind. I'm going to train my mind in the paths of three scopes, and I'm going to listen to this Dharma, and not just listen to it, but really contemplate it, meditate on it, and effectuate the kinds of activities that will work for the benefit of others. And so setting such a motivation for listening to the teachings, this is something that is greatly beneficial in terms of the results that will arise from our actions. So we should please set a good motivation for listening to the teachings.
Lingshipae Satopja, Pule Jure, Devane, Ligita, Semgita, Tini Konar, Seven Dose, Ta Jabulia Sudwa, Lingshila Wang Jabula Soba to the Jura Inayase, Titoba Inaya, College Jabuto Shina, Titawatalia, and the Ligita Wata Semgita Wani Budese, Tawadala Nikona Severese, Tini Kona Severdose. Kevuchu Ling Shiba Topja, Ling Shila Wangi Koluju, Kevatabuchi Toba Inaya, Tewatala, and Luigi, Soa Tewata, Semgi Tewa Ni Konar Seba, Severese, Ya Otichulam.
So here, then picking up in the text from verse 346, and so here, this is really refuting inherently existent objects of attachment or real feelings of pleasure, and then we'll get into refuting inherently existent suffering and so forth. But beginning with the first of these, which is refuting some kind of real feelings of pleasure, it says, even after a wheel-turning monarch attains governance over the whole world with its 4 continents, pleasure for him is still considered to be only twofold, physical and mental. So again, here he's speaking to the king, and so even a king who is a wheel-turning monarch who has dominion over the 4 continents, for him it is still the case that there are only these two, physical feelings of pleasure and suffering and mental feelings of pleasure.
뭐야? 다들에도 아까 소래. 단디 보시, 뭐지? 다 리지디 짜와데라, 십주십된데라. 리지 소화 대화내서도 코에 리지 소화 대화내 동해체나 동해치나 쩌마 잠시 리지 가서래 리지 소화 대화내 동해체나 리지 소화 대화내 동해치네 쩌바자 어데 동해데마 총드럽시 도야 겁려야네 대화디 용구여데 셈베라 리지 소화 대화내 동해체나 쩌마 잠시 semdidapa chik lomba tsam semgen dushi rangshe de tokbe cheba kwa semge dewa sayde semge samlu tangcho tang tende tsoho chen yungu re sar sire dowa tate kasi to san luji tsoha dewa ne tungen che na chema tsam se tungen de ma nyur shiwa samla ane tewe samlu chik korche tende shi yungu re ti dewa kasi re chema tsam re ma to dewa rangchenpa ma re se ngē chung se shu churu songya nekab chi o tere to ngē to zu churu ruya nekab tila ane tewe samlu kye ne o yabu chung song sa tewe dushi kye gwara ma to tewa rangchenpa ma res tewa ngone ki ta ranga changi dhruva se gwa ma ta rangchenpa tewa ngone se ke ma res kame de churu dhruva zan ta tewa lom ne korang su su suwa tewa pa lom ne nyong te gwa res gwa 동해 중세 숙청으로 소면 내갑지 소화 심바 녀와스도 대화 녀와스라 심바 대화 랑챈바 랑챈바 심바데 어디 강에 초를 도와들야 대화문에 지임을 삼데 넘게 와래서라 동해 질주지 대화 점도 마도 와서 동해도 또 저녀도 내가 나네 대화 넘바 삼마도 지대 동해 랑챈바 여자이 코알이야 동해대 원에 다니지 와래서 대화대 랑챈스마데 마레스고라 동해 랑챈바 여자 대화 랑챈바 중세게 메도세 동해대 동해 원에를 시대에서고라 코에 동해대 대화대 대화 랑챈 원에서 마레서 강에 지존이 팀에베 내급되네 코랑코랑 섬도 답배하고 전소 삼제 롬데르 마도 비대화 원에게 마레스고라 야티질라나
So sorry, I shouldn't have said suffering there, but that there is only really twofold physical and mental pleasure. And here then turning to verse 347, it says, then a pleasurable physical sensation is just comparatively less pain. Mental pleasure by nature and attitude is just conceptually created. So samsaric pleasures, physical pleasures, are really just the reduction of suffering, right? When suffering has become lesser, we then exaggerate that as being pleasure. So here it isn't the case that there is actual pleasure. And here the term is sometimes one that we use in terms of like inherent existence, but this is talking about real within the world, that when our suffering becomes relatively less, the mind is sort of satiated by that, or we have a feeling of satiation and gratitude grasp at it as being really pleasure, but it isn't actually a pleasure. It's just a kind of exaggeration of mind, merely a reduction in the suffering that we were experiencing. And so in the world, though, there is real suffering, right? Not inherently existent, but again, real suffering. Whereas when it comes to samsaric pleasure, it's not really pleasure, but rather it is something that is just a little bit of a reduction in our suffering that our mind exaggerates as being pleasurable.
뭐야? 단다 갑될 셔야게 랑쳔바서데 랑게 천니지 주바서 가지고 각자를 세셔봐. 랑쳔바서 랑게 천니 주 들으시고 말해서 뭐네게서 뭐네게 대화를 말해서 뭐네게 코에 동에데 동에 뭐네래서 대화데 대화 뭐네 매베서듯이 강에지 총을 쓰면 내가 소소 넘어마도 말해서 시기도 뒤에 그 대외 교대 가서래 강에지 총을 줘야 되네 대외 로데 그도 게 마도야데 대외 교대 다가 여나야 대화도 다가 되게요 말해 세상로 맞sam시거라 그 당부 강에 총을 줘도 그 좋아 줘라 답에 야부래서 섬겨라 다들 강에 총을 줘가래 야티 다가 되게 말해 또 손에 예도 그 매우샤라 그 대외 교랑 제바이네 단다 대고라 뒤 대면 도셔라 다 코에 동해랑 제바래 샤스 그냥 거르시 나게나 go nana bado ko nada grede ta go nasa sparushili ko nasa me cha tende se yo mara nasa de te bado tunge de yo ra sa ko e tunge de tunge ngone re ko tunge kyudi kaje tebe ina ta ga tunge nyong go ra ko e dewa de ta ge kange chu do ne kam na hob de kale to je ga ko te war sor ma de ya tene te wa sor go ma se te jungone ge re me do sora kange chu se ba te lo ba sam de sha se go ra o te ji lamna.
So here it's important to be clear that when we're referring to this as like ultimate or really pleasure, this is the same kind of rangtsempa that it is often used for the object of negation, but here it's not referring to that kind of the object of negation existence by means of its own characteristics, but really within samsara, it is the case that we don't have real pleasure, as in it's just the reduction of suffering that we exaggerate as being pleasure. It's like if the kind of suffering that we are experiencing is reduced some due to a particular cause, we think like, oh yeah, this is nice, but it's not as though that remains. It disappears. That kind of happiness is just fleeting. Whereas when it comes to suffering, we have real suffering, right? As long as we have a headache, that headache is going to be suffering. It's not the same sort of situation as with pleasure, wherein it is a case of there being a kind of reduction temporarily in the suffering that we were experiencing, and our mind takes that as being pleasurable. It inflates that or exaggerates it to be pleasurable, but rather there is real suffering within samsara, whereas there's not real pleasure.
Oh yeah, that is that is oh, 동해 지주바 삼로 샤워 세드시라 가도 응원보네 세볼나 뛰자 세보다 뛰자 공원봉원보라시 되기도 알로게 왔다 소아 동해니 대화 수초에 내급을 샤고 말해서 그러나 동해원에 라게 되게 동해 규디 봐도 소아 동해여라 그래서 대화 내급을 샤메 거 봐라 동해질로 끼그레셔라 소아 동해 여라 정부라 또도 통로로 깨와다 동해 슈 초에 내급지 중세 선바고 소아 선버녀와 대나를 끼그라 나와라 대로 깨버세도스 어디질렀나.
So here it gives, and this is in the commentary, a kind of explanation that if you have the colors blue and yellow and so forth arranged, this color, like you only give rise to the mind apprehending blue, not the kind of mind apprehending yellow. So too, when it comes to our feelings of suffering, it isn't the case that those are posited on the occasion when our happiness has been reduced. We can have the mind that feels suffering without that kind of relative reduction in our happiness. That's what it's getting at with saying there is real suffering. However, when it comes to our feelings of pleasure, in the same like when it comes to our feelings of pleasure, in the same way that when we posit long independence upon short, it is when the mind feels like there's sort of this appearance of there being some kind of satiation because of a reduction of suffering, that we give rise to a feeling of it being pleasurable.
Oh yeah, the Shigebanal Saviors of the Shigebanal Dade, the Pechan Shedwa, Langa the Toti Kitchen do you know? Toti Kashi Pumbekan Kigdo, Digan Kigdo, other Pumba de Sudan Nasona, a Kotia Kashi, the Jode Supena, the Veno Shagada, or Tayabuchos, Lily Shara, Dozer, Yina Kondi Kalet Mail Shasa, they she never go to Tayabuchos. So at the Nawa Kigara, but the Tawaka Mari, Tagikale, the church in the negative del Cote or Lombard is Segara. Oh, Tanashi, Tinashi Lamgara Children. That's hard as a chin. Tashi was it suggestion, Tamu Sajil Shasuna, the Velo Kigra, Tape of Chonsum. Tate Tawa Mune Ransem Marisara. Tagin Chachi, the Kangeti Machors, the Telia, Tawa Lombard is Sarah. 당원에 대화 얘네 단다 가져 되나 소화 대화 대고라 뒤대 말에 버르질 칸이 저도 당아 소화에 서실lep나 사이냐 그 요래 제라 삼기로 하지 어디인데 그 대화란 sem버에 멘두세 대화란 sem버에 대외 규디 다가 되나 대화란 대고르지 대면 도와세 동해지 주지에나 고르지 나는 나자를 당치 지우는 나자 맞아봐도 동해에 냐되라 미직지 녀다 땅에는 나서다 되라 그 동해 규디 정해 중원에를 샤고나 규디 여에 봐도 동해에 대도 샤라 어디지라나 엔디도 야
So here, this is also explained in Aryadeva's 400 verses, like in the way that if you're carrying something along the road, and say you have it on this shoulder initially, you're like carrying a bag over that shoulder, and it gets really tired, and so you shift it to your other shoulder. Well, you're going to feel like, oh, that's pleasurable, right? Like, oh, this is nice, I'm getting relief. Well, it's really just, again, a reduction in that suffering that we are exaggerating as being pleasure, but there's not really a true pleasure there. And so too, like if we're walking along a road and we get really, really hot and we go and sit in somewhere that is cool, we think, oh yeah, this is a pleasurable experience because we think that it is pleasurable, but it's really just a reduction in that suffering of heat. Again, we'll eventually feel cold and then feel like, oh, I need to go seek out somewhere that's hot. So it's not the case that as long as we are relying on that cause, we are going to experience pleasure. If it were the case that there were real true pleasure, then as long as we rely upon that particular cause, like going and sitting in a cool place, we would have to experience pleasure from that. But we can see that that's not the case. Whereas when it comes to suffering, so long as the cause of that suffering is there, we are going to experience suffering. If your head is hurting, as long as you have the causes for that, you're going to have a headache. It's going to be suffering. So this again is extensively explained within Aryadeva's 400 verses.
뭐 다들 패스 세슈지들이 말아도 맹가르질래 칼라사마도 패스 야 드라마도 같이 냥제 나서르시나로 다들 자주 수 나랩스나 다 소고도 탄다 여러 전에 현다 가면은 배야고래도 삼체 땡기라 술래네 다들 칼라르제 사야 지금마다 메르체드 대외 좋아 슈첨부지라 다이네 배야고 전수산나다 그때 교대 때 나자라는 나자 매체 단다 때려 그냥 초를 손로라 이마치 신이 신이 때체 단 그때 나자 매나 게레면도 서양 동행 고추 현당 고추로 자 그것도 때에 교인의 때 따와를 때와도 때대고로 소화도 되 말어 당이 강에 숙청부터 좋은자 대예상 안에 숙청부터 좋아라 대외 손한테 준 것도 그때 대원원의 교인아 대외 교문에게 말해서 당이 강에 되어서 tin초를 해서 삼바레스 롬바삼레 소소 삼록 봐주셔 소소 류심을 팬베스지 녀아들 대화스기도 류다삼을 팬 어따야 붙여 소삼 류심을 내베스지 유대 녀아이네 동해서 요라 What is it?
So, like to give another kind of clarifying example, if we were to go to a hospital, like when we're really sick, we can't eat, we can't move very much, and so we're so sick, and then we get medical treatment and we're released from the hospital, we think like, oh, this is happiness, this is so pleasurable, and we're able to go home and we're able to eat and so forth. But slowly that starts to disappear, right? We are not going to have that kind of feeling of happiness or pleasure for very long, and soon other sufferings will arise, right? So it seems as though that experience of being cured from whatever illness it was is actually pleasurable, but it's really just a reduction in the kind of suffering that we were experiencing before. It's not actual pleasure, but rather something that is exaggerated by mind. Whereas when it comes to our suffering, that is something that as long as it's there, it's going to remain as suffering. It's not sort of like the kind of fleeting feeling of happiness that we get when we exaggerate a reduction of suffering as being pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, better. Oh, yeah. Tayina Yasido. Kasura. Choa dewa tende chenani, choa koa lea, choa dewa te mendo ase. Choa dewa tanya dewa mea se koda se. O tende labjiwa maris. Taga choa dewa shaa kore shara. Kona choa dewa lombaro. Ko lesin pepe se. Kona kibure choa ra. Taga choa dewa shaa kore. Choa dewa tanya dewa mea se yo maris. O ti la kore se. Ya kashes no o tengo netene. Koa la choa dewa te mendo ase shana. Tanya dewa mea se shana se. Ti maris ora. Choa dewa tanya dewa mea do she koa dewa mea se. Kēwa nē shīgyabē nāla yu tē tē sōntō yā tīndrī bachē. Nē, tōkbē tākbē tūngē rāngchēmbā yu jāng, tēwā rāngchēmbā mē bachē bachā wā tā tē rī tāndā. Tōkbē tākbē, nē tūngē rāngchēmbā yu wā rē sē, tōkbē tākbā sē nē. Tēwā rāngchēmbā yu wā mā rē sē, tēwā tākbā wā rē sē, kā sē sēm yu lōmbā tsam sē wā rā, tākbā wā rā sē mē rē. Wā tē rē sē wā rā. Yā tē chī lām nā.
So here, though we shouldn't say that it is kind of disparaging pleasurable feelings, as saying like even conventionally there's not a feeling of pleasure within samsara. Again, this is one should know this as it is extensively explained from within Aryadeva's 400 verses. However, one should recognize that pleasurable feelings are really just a kind of exaggeration of mind, something that is designated on a reduction of a feeling of suffering. So here, it's not as though we're saying, well, even conventionally, there's no sort of pleasure, but rather it is that is something imputed, designated by mind, and is merely that. And so although there is a kind of actual suffering that is designated by mind, there is no actual pleasure. We should recognize that. So here it is important to recognize that it's not sort of disparaging or undermining that there is pleasure within samsara, but it's not real pleasure.
Oh, yeah. 다들 temba se 다들 니바 se 다들 지대 때에 너무 그래서 솔로가 쉽게 되다. 지대 때에 너무 그 동해 지네 쇼삼다 동해리아 대화로 버쳐 삼데스. 지대 때와 너무 그 지대네야 대화세 당연 너무 대 참마시고라. 동해 지네 줘봐서 동해 초도 내가 우리 안에 semjo samre segara. Tokpa tsam ni yin de ser, tene tendo teme dosa, tene kasi dosa na, jiten tewan tokpa kune tunge chini choba samda, tokpa ke pa, tokpa tsam ni yin becher, tewa lomba tsam yin becher, tewa tene tendo tewa ranchenba me dosa ra, yo maresa, wati chulamna.
So then turning to the verse 348, which is then says, since it is just comparatively less pain or merely conceptually created, all the pleasure in the world is ultimately not really pleasure. So what we call pleasurable feelings within the world, all of those things that exist are merely, again, a reduction in suffering. And they are things that are merely conceptually designated, as in they are exaggerations of that reduction in suffering as being being pleasurable. And thereby we can say that in actuality, there is no real pleasure.
뭐야, 다 숨바 쉐바스. 쉐바를 니시아 subject이라도 대화랑 전배 줍시 가고스. 다 대화랑 전배 예배 줍시 가고스라. 근데 뭐 가고스. 다 담보니 대화랑 전배 예배 줍시 가고들니 이제 대화랑 전배 줍시 가. 이제 대화랑 전배 예세 대 줍시 시단 거라 대바가. 리지 대화랑 전배 요리 대 줍시 가면 도 다 담보니서 야 가서스나 리지 통해랑 전배 줍시 가고더라. 대가서도스나 이지 대화랑 전배 줍시 가봐 리지 대화랑 다 이지 대화랑 전배 줍시 가고더다. 이지 대화랑 전배 요대 대개배 교원주 예배치 단 시한 도박고 요라. 이지 대화랑 전배 매세트 되면도서 이지 대화랑 전배 요래서 그래서는 대개배 원주 원주 다 예배치 대개배 교라. 단 지대 제바부 켈랭게르지나 다 자완데서는 원주 켈랭게서 사실 원주 근식된 강가 쪽이라. 대화도 동해 강가도 되게 교체네 좀 거래서 대 공부시네. 대화 국어도 선도 대화 동해 국어선 대기 왔어라. 대화를 잡아 이게 대화를 잡아 요래. 그 가래서는 대개배 중원주 예배실. 다시 원주 예배실 대화 경주. 신나서 다들 바꿔게 왔다. 근데 대화 집에 준대 받다. 원이지 대회 교매대 재선도다면 대회 중원에 말해서라 대회 주인이 대화다 재선도다 싶고 그라 뒤에는 대화 중을 팅해봐도 여공게 뒤에는 대화 mention게 싶고라 대화중 원주대 예매를 대화 중 맞춰도 대화중 원주를 뜨고 말해서라 대회 주신다 신을 뜨고 말도 대화중 원주를 뜨고 말해서 그래 같은 등마다 그냥 아주 나사르지 청스나 남사 자자자 도르마다 라장하주네 라장하주 서로지 소아답지 대신에 자고라 기자고 말아 암지살 누구도 그거 좀 주고야라 그것도 자해 그때 자자가 지치고도 마다 라장하주 지금도 라장하주 예바 잠지 지용기네 암지살 좀 먹어라 그 제로신이 제셔라 지니 말은 지금 말아 자 암지살 좀 마도 개와매게 차래 야 어디질라나
So then we get into the more extensive explanation, which begins with a refutation of the proofs of there being real pleasure. And that is further divided into refuting proofs of real mental pleasure and then of real physical pleasure. And so here, beginning with the kind of refutation of the proofs establishing real mental pleasure, someone might say, and this is going to come in verse 349, but first, someone would say, well, there is a real mental pleasure because the cause for generating that is Indra, for example. And so here, there are those who would assert that there is some kind of creator God that is the cause of all pleasures. Now, in refuting that, it would say that, well, asserting that Indra, for example, is the cause of real pleasure, that's not an acceptable kind of proof of there being real pleasure because it isn't the case that those always follow after. So for example, if you have this kind of a creator God that's always existent, like Indra, for example, it would have to be the case that all of these pleasures that he is the cause of would have to always sort of be existent. But if we take, for example, like when you're sick and you go to a doctor to get cured from that, you don't just propitiate Indra and you're able to be relieved of that. But there are rather other causes and conditions for those kinds of pleasures, or at least, what we designate as pleasure within the world. And so therefore, asserting that something like Indra or some kind of an all-powerful being is the cause of pleasure is not a suitable kind of a proposition.
네, 제선조다세도 제선조다세대 제부터 교대를 제선조다게 잡아줘라. 대화대당 원주 첨벌이야 제선조다 대화 좀 말해서라. 동해 대 원주 제선도다 저 두고라 제선도서 변에 도와대 매 도와 간도 여바터 매게 봐도 여고라 매매나 도와 용구 말와 제선도서 때라 도와 여서 때라 매게 봐도 여고라 매매나 매 당분에 매나 때라 도와 용구 말와 도와 간도 있어 때라 도와 교대 여고래 전주처럼 도와 교대 매나 매드 매나 도와 용구 말와 때라 제선도다 저 두시거라 이 원주다 대화리야 제선도다 저 말했어거라 뭐야 되지라
So here, the last line of the commentary that comes before this verse 349 says that because the sort of forward and reverse, we can say pervasion are not established. So here, it isn't the case that you can establish that this always follows after, or that if there, like for example, if you have smoke, you know that there is fire. Fire follows after smoke, and when there is no fire, then there's going to be no smoke. And so similarly, you can establish that kind of in the absence of that thing, the absence of the cause, there won't be the result. And so too, in this case, their assertion that Indra, for example, is acting as the cause, then that would mean that if he's the cause of pleasure, then there would always be pleasure as long as he is there. And so there is no establishment, or there's no the complete kind of following after the forward and reverse in that case.
뭐야 다 데리다 다 데리다 가서래 쉽쉽시고들아 링다 유다 내다 김제라 다들 때에 주로 주시도 링다서 유제 리시 롱바라 텐데네 링가라 텐데다 롱바체 내체 김康바체 토다스도 모터다 식 세컨다다 따다 바란트세 파스데 초다 땡다 땡땡땡다 둘러드세 둘러거야 그 남다시야 근데 매샤 예제듯이 사예체 동예체 서동 랑부 셔라 소바 따다 내 김장에 배매다 개발을 소바 배매 배매 제자 그래서 되게 자와들다 다 대야 링다 유다 내다 김다 초다 땡다 그남 다 매샤다 서동다 랑부다 따다 배매다 조선부 대단해 롱제자 롱제자 레레세바 다 롱제자 롭지라 센텐데 요레세 텔레테네 또와케 그레세르세 what did you learn
So then coming in the root verse 349, and here it's listing off these things that are causes of worldly pleasures. So it says the continent, countries, places, houses, conveyances. We could think of that as like cars and various ways in which we get from one way to another. Seats, clothing, beds, food, drink, elephants, horses, and women are all enjoyed at distinct points in time. So here, as opposed to there being a kind of universal cause of pleasure, this is a listing off various objects that are causes of pleasure, that are that give pleasure at distinct times.
오야 다 솔로 강압주더라 압주바다 강제 강라 셈 죽바세 대세 대세 트라스 강게세 강라 셈 죽바 대세 되게 따와 예시 따버려서 하마 일라 메시베 되네 던도 되메도 되메니사 반데코란 데발로션 주의 강게세 강야 로아 론초발라 대오냐베 셈 중와테 체 대세 롬바탈스 강알야 론초바테세 라 네 초아 심버리 중에 로중와테세 대와뇨아세 지데나 타와나 신세라 대세 롬바탈라세 셈기파 롬바 아니 그래 직롱 쉐제 대오냐베 론중와테세 사마예라 메시베테세 라마남 던도 란제 베테베 gyuru tome bani yu mambuchi yu tu chebe ina ko migi tongya da tanya da mambuchi yu tu chebe ina migi tongya de la mi se tokpa kan chuna o te yagu to asamba ina ti tewa nyongiri mato shenda to su tona ya tewa nyong tu ma re su wara tokpa de yin shimi kogdo tokpa ke lo chu chi tewa nyambe lo junga te se sangma yi la me chi shenda te tokpa yu tu che tu ma re ti tewa nyongi o ma re su wara musum ki tonga sa ma to me shi be te se lama nam tendu ransen be tewe kyuru neba nyi to o se o te ransen tewe kyuru ransen ba rik ma re se chu sumbu te da ngo nyi je tewe kyu yin na se ta tewe kyu ta te le chu sum she ra o te chu sum she ba te da ngo nyi je tewe kyu yin na se wara le long ma je se ma ten be se ya tewa ke ri na se ko tewe kyu yin na tradi bina ma de na tradi yu na so so tewa ke go re se wara o tradi tragi sa so te na ma te na te choli yi ma de na tradi te na ka so yi tokpe te choli sama ma da na tewa ke go re se wara ko tewe kyu yin na long ma je je ma ten be se ya tewa ke ba re na te me be chiri ane ka tewa ke ba re na che ne te me be chir da ne yu chik long che be che long ma nam la long che ba me be chir te da yu ba tsam ji tewe kyur me re so te yu ba tsam ji tewe kyur rik ma re se tok ba ke pa yang sam lu re ta che o te ya gu do sam sa yi te te sho lian do re te le sam tang kur ma do shen da te tsam ki ngu ma re se wara ya te chi la na
So then, continuing into verse 350, it says, one has pleasure through whichever of these the mind attends to. So there are these like 13 things listed above as being causes of pleasure. And one has pleasure through whichever of these the mind attends to, but one does not attend to the rest. Hence, they are not ultimately causes of pleasures. So whenever one attends to one of those various kind of objects, enjoys that object, there arises the mind that thinks, oh, this is pleasure. But again, this is just, we can understand this as being a kind of exaggeration of that at that time, thinking, oh, this is pleasurable. And when one is enjoying one of those things, one gives rise to this thought of, oh, this is pleasurable. And so if these many causes of pleasure are listed, it is the case that they would have to sort of always bring about pleasure. But we can see that, like, for example, if the visual consciousness apprehends one particular object and doesn't apprehend others, it's rather the mind that designates that as being, oh, this is pleasurable. So here, like, if it were the case that all of these objects were really pleasurable, then even if the mind were not attending to them, were not engaged with them, they would be the cause of pleasure. But here we can see that whatever it is that one is individually enjoying, one then doesn't give mental attention to the rest of those. And at that time, those are not in actuality then the cause of real pleasure. And so if it were the case that these 13 things listed above were really truly like actually the cause of pleasure, then even when you're not enjoying them, not recalling them, it would be logical for them to generate that kind of pleasure. However, that's not the case. It's only the case that we are able to designate something as pleasure based upon what the mind is attending to and what the mind is sort of exaggerating as, oh yes, this is pleasure. So it's not as though just by their very being, it is suitable to say that they are the cause of pleasure.
o ya ta le ji tawa ran chen ba yu be tu chi ka bu te re do yu nga tu ba te tu chi yin ba ka wa se yu nga su ta tu re sha la so ba yu nga te ra ane tawa ran chen ba yu be tu chi ba ka wa re re Rere trupchi imba kaba, niduwa nga tu trupchi imba kaba, rere ne trupchi imba kaba. Ta tambo ne yu nga ya tewa tu chikdo, nyongde se, ta kachik se wara. Yu nga ya tewa tu chikdo nyongde, karkhenki sukda, lingbuda ka tundoka tamkari chena, ra. Karkhenki sukda, lingbuda tangda trachanda yungura, trachanda, agaru trita, agaru la soba tindaga timashibu. Tinday tikayata. Tangzi roda, goye reksha nga, goye reksha, wambu nga nyamso nyongo shina, wate nga gade, tewa tuchido yongya duwa se, tinday nga te nyongore sena se kaji se gora. Ta mila sokwa wambu nga se, yu nga, zinche se, zinbe se, gange chere, tokbar meche te chere, tese tela tewa me se, yide inchi meche te chola toko re se, samla tango re se wara. O te yabu dua sam, tinte samla tani yongo mache, yu nga wambu le charo samji tewa nyoya ngeba yo ma re se gara. Shol kangab chunga che terda, dreba peche tinte ichire lo na lo se. O me la sobe wambu nga yu nga jimbe che, te che tewa nga tu chikdo, me te se yo ma re se ra lo ba ya. Gange chena, tokbe maso na, teware, me shiba kanga sheshe. Tokba ke samli yi tege, samla tangwa, yi te chol samla tangwa. Te samla tana tewa hako tongma re sara. Yu nga da tewa nga tu chikdo, tokbar me shiba shirsa. Yu nga ga tu chikdo, ane tewa nyoya tende yongma re sara. Ya.
So then next we turn to the refutation of the proofs for real physical pleasure. This is divided into refuting an aggregation of the 5 objects as a proof for real physical pleasure, and then refuting the individual objects of the 5 senses. So here, beginning then in verse 351, this gives a refutation of the kind of refuting the aggregation of those 5 objects as a proof for real physical pleasure. So if you were to experience at one time the 5 like objects of pleasure, so if you were to have like an actor performing, so that would be the form, and then the sound of the vina or an instrument, the smell of like aloe wood or akuru, that smell, as well as like experiencing the taste of honey, and the kind of pleasurable touch of clothing, that would be pleasurable, right? That's sort of what is being proposed. And then in this verse 351, it says, the 5 sense faculties, such as the eye, do not conceptualize the 5 kinds of objects that they apprehend. Therefore, at that time, one does not perceive them as pleasant. So here, it's not as though the eye sense power and the other 5 sense faculties, when they apprehend these 5 objects at a single time, can have them be pleasurable. And why is that? Well, it's because they're not held by mind. And so whatever is not sort of known or held by mind is then not able to be the cause of pleasure. So here, if one is in sort of indulging in pleasurable objects of the 5 senses, it's only the case that whatever the mind attends to and conceptualizes as pleasurable will be pleasurable. It's not as though those exist in and of themselves as pleasurable.
Oh yeah. Kanga chunga ni dira sholoka. Kanga yu ni kanda kanga yu kanda kanga. Ombu kanda kanga shebar churba se. Tese langma. Tese langma. Tese langme langma yi. Kanga tishiri. Temi nisa. O tade karsi dosna. Kanga che sula soba yu ni kanda kanga. Ombu kanda kanga shebar churba tese se gara. Tese ombu langma. Yu lama jimba tela kebe tewa me te ese. Ta yu kanyi rungwa yi te ese tele tewa yore, shenda te tewa nyuma rese. Kange chena te ese yu lama nam tewe tantu mewe chirse. Tewa kebe shile yo ma rese, ka yi ki Tichola macho se tisemra. Ya tichulano.
So then the next verse, 352, says, when one is aware of one of the five kinds of objects by means of one of the senses, one has no awareness of the remaining kinds of objects by means of the remaining senses, because those remaining objects are not taken as objects at that time. So here, when you have something like at whichever time one it takes the object of form and so forth, that is what is known by that particular sense consciousness. And so at that time, the other sense faculties don't apprehend the remaining object. So there is no generation of pleasure at that time. Again, as it says, because those remaining objects are not taken as objects at that time. And so therefore they can't be like really pleasurable.
Oh, ya ta solo ka ngajunga sumdera. Oh, te karsido sina. Wambo yene mikyur basa. Wambo ke yunga te mikyo na yasa. Debe yuki nambala sa. Debe yuki nambala. Yiki mine. Yiki mine. Tokwa nasa. Ta yidi ticholia samlutane. Sosulution le pembe suja nebe suji kari mete. Yiki ko tsorko yara. Tokwa na teo nyamdo lombarche. Ene tewa kieso nyamdo tichirse. Yiki tichol matena. Lusion le pembe suji samlu matana ene ko yun jimba ina tewa nyamgo mare semra. Wombo yene yu migbari gyurba randu na nebe yu ki namba yu ki mine tokwa na teo nyamdo lombar sheba yin la ase gyu chik la tokwa duma chik char me jewe chirse yu shenda kanga la ya tewa nyong toku marade gyu chik do tokwa rik metin batin do mabu chiya yo mare shibara ya tilo.
So then in 353, it says, the mind perceives the image of an object that was perceived in the past by the sense faculties. Perceiving it, the mind conceptualizes the image and believes it to be pleasant. So it follows that when it comes to our perceiving objects, our sense faculties actually observe objects that have already passed. So when the mind conceptualizes those objects or takes those as an object, it is merely sort of exaggerating the pleasure on the basis of that. And it's not possible again, when we view something as either being beneficial to us or harmful to us, it's not the case that our conceptual thought can, in the single continuum, give rise to multiple concepts at a single same time.
Vale eso. Oh, yu lama nam tewe tondu meba nyuchi. Solo ka ngabju nga sondero wa.
Ngapshungashidi.
Nga sondero wa.
Ngapsumdi drosasa.
Chasongre.
Oh.
Tata lombar stetesa. O tandisha, nipala nisa. Muta tujo o tandido. Ya tandido. Ngabju nga shidira.
Nare.
Ine wangbo chiki ne. Tenchik sheba kanyi bas. Teya teme par teme. Teya teme par teme. O tati karsido sana. Ngabju nga shidira. Jitena miktabi wangbo chiki esikidwa. Jitena miktabi wangbo chiki esa. Wangbo chiki ne. Dine wangbo chiki ne se. Tenchik sheba kanyi basikidwa. Wangbo chiki ne su tabi tenchik sheba kanyi bataya. Suji ten me bara. Suji ten me bara. Miwangi ten me ba ten me la. Miwangi ten me la. Suji ten ya. Miwante me bara. Ten me ba ala chidi mena chidi kaya tanda sang marisi gara. Dine wangbo chigi ne. Tenji shiba kanyi ba. Tenya ten me par ten me. Tenya ten me par ten me se. Karsido jiden dinas, mig tabi wambu chigini, su tabi tanchik, sheba kanyi batayase, su jitan mebar, miwan jitan mebar, su di mena ni miwan jitan chituk matang. Su jitan ya miwan mebar, tan mebese, di su di zimbal miwan mena tan mebese. Tenzi tebe chirsa, miwan tang, su tang, tetu te nani namshi kiyagura. Penzi tebe chir, ngonyi ji, me naase, te mebe, luji tewa rangchenpa me tosa, ta rangshin ki kiwa, ngonyi ki kiwa, rangchenpa me tosa, ya tishi lamna, luji.
So then, second is a refutation of the proof of the individual objects being the sort of real physical pleasure. And there's the actual, and then the refutation of that proof. And so here in verse 354, it reads, a single sense faculty knows a single kind of object, but without that object, it is not really a sense faculty. And without that sense faculty, the object is not really an object. So here in this world, if we take like the single, like the eye faculty, for example, it knows a single kind of an object, like a form, for example. But if it is lacking a form, then it's meaningless to speak about an eye sense faculty, right? These are mutually contingent, mutually posited upon one another. So here, it continues by saying that again, like in the absence of there being an actual form, then we can't, when there is a form, then it is not meaningless to talk about the visual sense faculty, again, because these are mutually contingent. And so here it is the case that, again, there's no real pleasure in that these two are mutually dependent upon one another.
Oh yeah. Tante tunzere kashishwa, namshi rangshinji chuba kawa chidwa, ane yu rangshinji chuba kawa, wambu rangshinji chuba kawa, ta pancha yungura, ta tambu yu wambu rangi ngoye, yu desa, kashi lagdwa, tambu ne yu dan wambu rangi ngoye yu de, ten debu namshi yu bishirsa, ta rangi ngoye chuba kelinge tsu ti lagdwa, yu dan wambu ramene chuba yu de, ten rebu namshi kenebe chirse nas, jitsu labdwa. Tatine te paa kawi chir. Chidar pata mata la, tene punen jung sheba, tishin migdan su tene, nambar sheba jungar she ese. Ta karse dose na. Chidar pata mata la, tene punen jungar sheba, tishin dos, migdan su la tene nambar sheba jungar sheba. Nambar sheba, rangshingi, me te eso rangshingi. Namshi de rangshingi me te, me ta su la tewe shir. Tagi me wata, me kin su la tewe ni ke kuyo de ko, rangshingi yo na, shan la tewe me tu ke kuyo ara. Kora rangshingi yo ara, rangwe ne yo ara. Kora ngwe ne yo ara, shan la tewe shin tewe me kuwa chi kuyo ara. O ti re towa. Kasi me ta su la tewe shir. Pena, hamada, pushin no se, tenjin rebar juwa yinbe shirshi, tenjin ti re se ora. Namshi rangshingi me te, me ta su la tenjin rebar juwa yinbe shirshi. Me ta su la tenjin rebar juwa yinbe shirshi. Ya, o ti shila na.
So then next, the actual sort of refutation of that proof then comes in 3 points that will come as we go throughout. That is refuting inherently existing consciousness, refuting inherently existing objects, and refuting inherently existent senses. And so here, the first of these is then it comes in verse 335, which is a refutation of inherently established consciousness. And so here, if one is to say that, well, the object and the sense powers exist by means of their own kind of essence, and therefore the result of those is consciousness, well, again, here, those that would assert that there's some sort of objective, independent existence to these objects, those that would say that there is this kind of objective existence, this is then being refuted in this verse where it says, just as a child comes into existence in dependence upon his or her parents, so too visual awareness is said to arise in dependence upon the eye and a visual form. So in the same way that it is only with the existence of a mother and a father that we can assert there is a child, right? There can be the coming about of a child. So too, it is in dependence upon the eye sense faculty and form that we can talk about there being the arising of visual consciousness. And so there's no inherently existent visual consciousness. If it were the case that there were, it wouldn't have to be dependent upon the kind of dominant condition in terms of the eye sense power or the sort of objective condition of there being a form. And so here we can refute that kind of inherent existence of the visual consciousness or of consciousness because it is dependent upon the eye and the form. Like, for example, how it is that a child is dependent upon their mother and father. And so this is the kind of reasoning of dependent origination that is being used here.
Oh, yeah. 다 되르다. 유다 원부 랑게 뭐 유대 때 대부 유배 칠수다야. 뭐 마와서 뭐 템바트바 켈랭게 줘라. 유다 원부 랑게 뭐 유대 때 대부 남시 유배 칠수다. 다 텔레파 데 자와시도와. 지다르 파다 마다라 때네 보내 중세바. 기시 미다 수때네 넘버 쉐바 중아 셰세 솔로카치도와. 어디 개박하셔서는 자와시럽게 슝으로 삼기어레스 대자시 슝마레세 어디셔도 지달파다 마다라 때네 중아르 쉐바 대신도 메다 수다 라테네 넘버 쉐바 중아르 쉐바 넘버 쉐바 라신기 메데 메다 수라 때베셔 페나 파다 마다라 때네 중아 신도세 빈탄데 디스마 단데 치체 디스고라 타마 치체더라 로벤 다와타베 치세도 장샤스우라 치세날 론데 장샤스 틴데 케바카셔스네 티 사시 론데 삼샤스우라 장바 전세게 셰바셔 전생아게 데바 전세세소라 어디 셰바친게 카셔 티 사시 론이 바시샤처 장샤스 티 사시 론 마레세 대다나 티 사시 론이나 사시 치체 시게다 시주 시구 요새 자가 개발적으로 주제 장가 교육서라 자와시를 주제 그저스네 실제 쉽게 쉽주 시구 요새 자가 개발 가지고 이제 봐 당연 계획 처리서 디지털 야 디지털
So here again, coming in the commentary prior to this verse, as those sort of realists would assert, they would say that, well, the object and the faculty are existent, objectively existent, and so therefore the resulting consciousness is also objectively existent. And here then the verse that follows again says, just as a child comes into existence in dependence upon his or her parents, so too visual awareness is said to arise in dependence upon the eye and a visible form. And so here, this is using the kind of reasoning of dependent origination to establish that, well, the visual consciousness or awareness is not inherently existent because it arises contingent upon the eye and a form, like how, for example, a child arises in dependence upon a mother and a father. And so here, this verse 355, some mistakenly attribute this to the root verses on wisdom by Nagarjuna, as quoted within Chandrakirti's clear words. And so this is a misattribution in terms of where this verse is coming from. Some assert that this verse is part of that text. And if it were like that, then it would contradict those scholars who have counted up the verses of the fundamental verses on wisdom, or those root verses that number 449. And so here we should understand that this is from this text here, not as it is sometimes mistakenly attributed to be from the root verses on wisdom.
Oh yeah. The Sumbani is Devata Mahobanam, Wambuda Cheba, Temela, Kashida, Ale, Tomati Roda, Namshi Ranshi, the Takachi Chisuda, Baba Manam, Namshi Ranshi, Yete, T. U. Sigara. Oh, Namshi Ranshi, T. U. Suda to the Jala Soba Yubichir Sigara. The Telebakar Sudas, Union Dead, Maonam, Wambu Tanshi, Temelas, Tini Leta, Temecher, Kanda Tatar Yang Temes, or Tetsama, Ranshiki Mesigara, Karsidosena, Union Dead, Maonam, Wambu Tansheba, Temes, Rangana to be Temesigara, Bella. Tini Tade, Tini Leta Tademe, Tini Leta Tadeshir, and a Kare, Kanda Tatar Yang Temes, or Tade Karsidosena. Yuni deba ta maomba namshi ta sheba gagba ta mao mato bechir gagba san deba se wara mato ba maomba se do ne de mao ni la ne de mao tini la ne de mao tini la ne mande be rangshin ji me ba tatarwa de mao ge tuna mena tatawa ten de mao ge tuna mena se rangi de mao tuna rangi mena se wara mena tini la mete bartal tebesir ore tini la mete bartal la se la mendo samta do dit tende ta ko ere sha te kasre parma shenta changbar ta amde parta sutana pecha kashana de tal la se to de mao ge tuna ena tini la mete bartal la ane mete bartal la tini la tebesir de mao mengenge ngobuchi ngumarwa tini la tebesir tini ji tuna yebarta dona tini tuna yebarta this was talas in any digdwa talas che mato che de tebumedwa tini la meteba tal tebechirserse meteba tal tebechirsena meteba talas peja khajana tidisdwa la jamna etachera tini la de maula meteba tagrese ten de marese de maula ngeba do teguras de maula mege gobashi ngu marase ora tini ji tuna yebarta dona tadawa de mao nile tadedo tuba mebecher ombuda chebe ten mela kang tadaya ten mebe namse ranshingi tuba meto ose namse tadarwa yu tadarwa zimbe ombuda teni ranshingi yu chena ya o tibado chilana ten mese tibado lana ranshingi tuba ten meto ose
So then next, we have in 356 here, it says, again, this is a refutation of the object as being inherently established. And so here one says, well, awareness or consciousness is inherently established because its objects exist. Well, if you are to say that, then it says here in verse 356, past and future objects are unreal, and so are past and future faculties. Present ones are not distinct from these two, past and future ones. Hence, the present ones are also unreal. So here, when it comes to objects, those that are of the past and those that are of the future, again, together with their consciousness, are either past, right? They are sort of passed by, or they do not yet exist in terms of future objects. So here, in terms of the past and the future, both of those, in the same way that they are not inherently existent, then here, if the present, this present then as well, is not existent in the past or the future. And here it is, again, because it is not just sort of contingent upon those two. If you were to say, it would follow that that's because it's not contingent upon those two. Well, that's not correct. It is contingent upon those two. Now here in the Tibetan, it has this part where it says it follows that it would not be contingent or dependent, and that should be followed by the ladun syllable that makes this then grammatically correct. I think that is in some of the texts, and then it says it would follow that they would not be contingent, and then it follows that with, well, because they are contingent. So here, it would follow that it would exist at those two times. And so if you assert that, then that would establish that the present is no different from the past and the future. And so here one would have to say that similar to past and future objects, which are contingent, so too then the present, because, and together with the sort of sense faculty that comes with that, would also become, like not have any sort of meaning. And so here, this is because they are not inherently established. So again, as it says, like the present objects are not distinct from these past and future ones in the sense that the present one is also contingent. It is contingent upon the faculty and so forth. And so here again, the kind of present is not inherently existent, and it follows that the consciousness is then not inherently existent.
오야. 오다 donda de tenjo lu shisha rwa. Tenjo lu shisha chido rangshin ki yo seda. Rangwine yo ba seda. Rang chanyi ki yo ba seda. Don dambar yo ba seda. Tsutup to yo ba seda. Teso kanga chiba dhugo ra. De shirang nipu na se che tamze rangshin ki tomba namba yang daba chisu tawa sunguda. Sa rangshin ki yo seda. Tenjen del ne kurang o sha me go risi kodhugo ra. Kurang rangshin ki yo se. Kurang rangshin ki rangi ngoyo yo ra. Kurang rangshin ki yo ra. Rangi ngoyo yo ra. Rangwine yo ra. Ro kurang ngwene tsu yo na. Shenda la tezi dene kuyo ngo sha me go risi kodhugo. Sa rangwine yo ba. Rangshin ki yo ba. Rangi ngoyo yo ba. Rangle yo ba. Rangle yo ba. Nga rang kote che na. Nga rang yo samsar tengdo so so che na. Tinge lu re sa. Tinge sim re. Tinge ngulakwa re yala re. Nga rang yo samsar. Shengwane che ne. Lakwa kangpa da sopo da. Simda tsowa da dushi la tezin del ne nga chi shaa kura ma to. Teza la del me gunga kura nga chi loga chi yo na ne rangshin ki yo do ra. Kura rangi ngoyo yo do ra. Ko tenzi del me gunga cha ra. Shenda tuzu pe kaga re so ra. Dagi ngoyo shaa pala sopo da simda tsowa da dushi tuzu me gunga cha ra. Me na kura ngoyo chi loga shaa ki do wa. Ti yo ma ra. Ti tongpa ni so ti kogo ra. Nga rangi samlu nal tindri si do wa. Nga sidi sopo da simda tuzu paa shaa ni 소소 셴도 요나를 셔도 나생게 저랑하듯이 다 치료받죠 이네도 가데 딱지 랑화제 나가 집에 기부스 나로 요새거라 딱바 인게 직부 인게 랑화제 인게 수로가 고 말에 수질 때고 말에 속에 나올 때고 딱바 땜바 tersu 수치된 데메고 속에 나올도 버테는 배 속보다 가가 자라 속에 나올도 봐 속에 차셔게 말아 그런 배 로가 집에 섬을 거다 되나 생각하죠 섬을 나 잡으려고 요라 나 섬도 직 라와도 심매는 맞대 요라 속보다 초하다 섬라 떼지 될네 에네 가서 누구 대기세 나기 사람 직 근데지 뭐도 매는 맞대 요라 말아서 지 여거나 시작도 어디 매발 꼭 요라 그뒤에 찍버려 랑은에 매봐 랑신기 매봐 랑강어 매봐 속tum도 매봐 랑은에 있는 속tum을 가지고 내려서 찍거나 현단 될 매거나 군주주 세치요 거라 뒤요 말에 그래서 강간 될 내마도 다 샤투예요 말아 어디 그뒤에 찍버려 뒤에데 겨단도 사랑 신기요나 샹라 때고 말을 세르라 현단 될고 말을 세르 뒤요에 뒤라 어디 줄라나
So here, this is being presented from the Prasangika kind of viewpoint. So when we talk about phenomena not being inherently existent or ultimately existent, objectively existent, sort of solidly, concretely existent, objectively from their own side, here, something that has that kind of existence would not be sort of dependently established, would not be a dependent origination. So we have this kind of sense of like, well, I exist by my own power, right? I exist objectively. When in reality, this I is designated upon the various kind of aggregates. And here, if it were the case that it had that kind of objective existence, it should be something that we can locate aside from, like our form and our mind and so forth, that we can set those aside and be able to point to something that is not contingent upon any of those, that's sort of like objectively existent in and of itself, that's set up by itself. And so here, there are non-Buddhists that assert there is a kind of self that is permanent, unitary, and autonomous. It's something that is permanent, isn't kind of lasting. It doesn't have various parts. It's not as though you can point to this self as being something that is that has any kind of parts, and it is autonomous. It's able to sort of bear analysis or stand up to scrutiny. It isn't just a part of the aggregates, or nor is it something merely designated on the kind of aggregates, but rather exists in and of itself. And so here, if we don't have the sense of there being that kind of an I, like we often think that if we didn't have such an I that was sort of set up by itself, that had this kind of autonomous existence, it would be kind of uncomfortable for us, right? But we have this feeling like there is some kind of an I that is set up from its own side, that is inherently existent, ultimately existent, existence by means of its own characteristics, essentially existent. There are many sort of synonyms that the Prasangika school uses, but it seems like there's something that we can point to that isn't dependent upon anything else, that isn't contingent upon our various aggregates, that exists in and of itself. So when we talk about something existing inherently, that is something existing without having to have any kind of dependency or contingency upon other phenomena, that exists by means of its own power. And that is what we are referring to here when we see things like objective existence or inherent existence. That's something that is refuted by the Prasangikas.
Oh yeah, ultimate. Oh, 다 남시 랑신기 요대수도야 그지라. 넘버 쉐바데 랑신기 요레스 가르시나. 남시 다다로한테 유 다다완 증기도 와서. 그래서 그 랑신기 매나 랑원의 매나니 유가르스 증고레스 거라. 남시 다다와 되게 유 다다완 증기 요레스. 그래서 원보다 더 랑신기 예시 나서. 맞아 저는 미기 쉐바게 수든 전도산도 다간 전서라 다들 로가지나니 그거 타대서 미기 쉐베 제마도 다가 유민 전서가 지그라 Miki Shebe Jinjisno, Tag Yunzin Sura, Lagwara Nagina, Ta Nagi Sura, Cotin Del Koda, Sokotan Del Mato, Ta Nagi Sudita, Sokumana, Ta Koran Loga, Naya Mara. Loga in the Kota, the Pe Sokole lost Chiokora, Tio Mara. The Tene Takwas, Tell a Drenage, Tanya Patane, Tanya Jawanga Shara. Kashachi domnani tisi resla, entera on resya, yebe kun shagur mado. Ane ko chashe tu lega chidu Quran lega chiba shagur ara. Ti chashe la mado ne del chi, ane Quran lega chinge, sopo lega chiba tu, taag lega chiba ndugu mara. Taag Quran lega loga ine tiki chawa chagura. Oya, ti sunda tanda di ku samla tansi dira. Namshi tada wa yi, tada wan jingi duwa, si mena ane kande zingure sigara. Wate rangshin ji yodo she nasi. Tatela kagwa chigara. Oh, tene rangshin ji yodo chena. Chita mingni chuba ye, game, kolon zinchi baas. Ra. Tishin, wambu namji ne, tada yoda zimbar chese. Pasirisina. Chitari mingni chuba ye, game, kolon zimbar cheba, teshin dose. Mingla, nazo chit, konda mera chipara, eni dus kore kyabna. Ke kogo thongura. Pe tinte pandu sene jogon jogo sene ko kogo thongura. Mune de kogo ke yo marwa. Ida du shukche ko sene kogo me kogo sto de to. Game kolo site sigara. Chita mene truba ye game kolo zinche bas. Ko jogon jogo korsa pe tu denge che thongge ara ne kogo che thong de to. Zinche bas jig che ba mar zinche bas udan de. Ne tishi wombo namje ne tade yuda zimbari ches. Odere. Chita mingni truba yen game kolo zimbari cheba teshen do sigora. Wambo namje ne tade yuda zimbari cheba yen geshe. Wambo na yuda nambar cheba kanya rangshinki me do se. Wambo a rangshinki yo mare, yue rangshinki yo mare. Nambar cheba rangshinki yo mare se, rangshinki. Kora rangshinki yo na. Chue me kuya che, Kurang rangshin ki yora. Shen la te si tene chue me kuya chi kuya yora. Ti si tende re da, na be lo le, tende mayi ki chue che yo ma re. Shen da si mambu si la te si tene, ni rangi ngo tu kuru ma do. Su chi le te me kuya Kurang kyangpa chi kuya yo ya si yo ma re, chi yo ma ra. O tende, chue tam cha tene je re ma re jo. Tene takwa. Takshita chashira mambu chi la tene, ni mingi paa taan, te tam la sha kuya ra. Tanya ji wangi ye sha kwa si. Tokpe wangi ye sha kwa si. Rawa yo ma re. Chashe da. Chashe la tene. Ni tokpe wangi pa tanya taan mingchi tashi de tawa ke le kuwa ra. Te tsam le sha kuya da. O ya da kuwa le su. O ti chi lam na. Maang zho me ra. Chita meni chuba ya gebe kon che shiba. Tishin wambu namje ne. Tade yudan zimbar shi ra. Chita meni chuba ye. Game kolo zimbar shiba te shendo. Wambu namje ne yu tata yu dan zimbar shiba yin je se. Wambu dan yu nambar shiba kanya rangshin ji chuba me te. Lo chuba la nawa samsara. Rangshin ji chuba nangi yora nga ra zule ya. Te chuda yora, norde yora sangara. Lo chuba la nawa samsara. Te tenpa ma re se. O ya, o de chi kyu na. Risa.
Oh. So here, if one were to say, the present awareness or consciousness by apprehending a present sort of object, the faculty and the sort of object itself would be inherently existent. Now here again, this these realists are trying to assert that both the sort of object as well as the faculty and the visual consciousness that arises from that are all inherently existent. Now, this is something that, again, the Madhyamikas would refute. Again, the I, particularly the person, is something that is dependently designated upon various parts. So when our visual consciousness apprehends an object, we can say, oh, I see that. Or if our hand is hurting, we say, oh, I'm injured, and so forth. But it's not as though there is something that exists in and of itself, but they are rather something that are merely posited by convention, that are merely dependently designated. So here, as it says, then the eye erroneously apprehends the circle formed by a torch being whirled around. Likewise, the sense faculties apprehend objects as if they were in the present. So again, this kind of opponent is trying to assert that there is some sort of inherently existent object, inherently existent faculty, and inherently existent awareness that arises from that. But rather, all of these things, like our apprehension of a kind of, again, if you take a firebrand and whirl it around, it's going to appear as if there's a circle of fire. And so, too, when it comes to this kind of the way in which phenomena exist, it is merely through the kind of being conceptually designated or conventionally posited. So here it is the case that when the sort of parts, there is a basis of designation, and on those various parts we designate, oh, it is this, or it does this. And so conventionally speaking, we can say that the present consciousness apprehends the present object, but yet it's like this example of when you view a firebrand that is being whirled around, there isn't any actual sort of circle of fire, but rather it's spinning fast, so we perceive it as such. So the faculty, the object, and the consciousness cannot be posited as somehow independently existing or being inherently existent, but rather are something that arise dependently. And so here, it's not, the Madhyamikas in particular would assert that there's not able to be some sort of isolated, independent kind of object, but rather it is the case that all phenomena are really a designation upon a collection of parts. We say, oh, this is this, and that is the way in which they exist is dependently designated, is designated by the power of terms and concepts. On a collection of parts, we say, oh, it is this, or oh, it is that. But there's no actual object of the present, as in no inherently existent object of the present. Rather, it is on the basis of a collection of parts that we designate, oh, that is an object. It appears to us as being inherently existent, but this is something that is false in that way. It's not actually inherently existent. It's merely a kind of mistake of mind, in the same way that when we are whirling around a firebrand, it appears as though it's a circle of fire.
Oh yeah. Tadirish Sumbala Sum said, Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba Sido. Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba. Wombo Tatara Shinji Tuba Kaba. And Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba. Tena Tara. Do I? Yeah,
So next we'll be getting into a refutation of the proof of the faculties as being inherently established. But as we've reached time for today, we will leave it there.
Oh yeah.
No.
What is?
Starting with next time verse 358.
Well, Gen Rinpoche, Kajin Che, and thank you so much to Katrina. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
Sorry. Oh, and just to let everybody online know, we will not have class, we have to let Geshe know too that we will not have class next week, because we are in a retreat here for Memorial Day weekend. And also the week after, because we have a special resounding event where we'll be reciting the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in 8,000 lines here over Vesak Day. Yeah. No?
Dundra Jema, Dindra Yomare Gela. Dundra
Oh.
Ni.
Oh,
Dundra
yeah.
Jem. Yeah.
준다니든가.
Long.
준다니 준다요 말해.
Dindra Yomare.
아야야 어디서?
Yeah.
어야 하고서.
So
라서.
he knows that. He's aware.
어야야 어디서? good.
Yeah,
라서.
she said he's aware of that. Yeah. Yeah, so everyone check our website online for the latest news, and we will affirm yet again over email. Okay. All right. Okay. So we'll close with some prayers. Sorry for the confusion.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Lobsang's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Iram Guru Mandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May a precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.
어야.
Recording stopped.